Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan, His Life and Times by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 13. From Leader of Pakistan's People to the Leader of the Third World, 1975. On 20th April, Bhutto hosted a banquet for Vice Premier Li Shuai of China, who had come non-stop from Beijing on a 6-day state visit. Bhutto and Li exchanged promises of steadfast support for each other's country against hegemonism and expansionism. They drank many toasts during those 6 days in April and discussed in detail ways in which China could help Pakistan develop its newly drafted program for building at least a dozen nuclear power plants over the next quarter century. At Chashma in Punjab, a large nuclear plant was well started, which Bhutto had hoped to see operational by 1979, but would not live to launch. A smaller nuclear plant was also started in Karachi. Pakistani friends can rest assured that the people of China will always remain their trustworthy friends, Li promised. In the future, joint struggle, we will always stand by Pakistani people. China is a nuclear power and a genuine nuclear power in contradistinction to phony nuclear powers, Zulfi told David Frost 3 weeks later in Pindi, explaining that India is a phony nuclear power. It does not have the economic infrastructure to really support a nuclear program. People are starving there. They have to really suck the blood of the people. The Indians have to go right deep into the bowels of their people to extract the money to do it. So, it is a giant with feet of clay. Like India, Pakistan had refused to sign the Nuclear Non Proliferation Treaty, which Zulfi felt was doomed to break down. Frost asked Bhutto which world leader had most impressed him, and he picked Chow and Li, saying perhaps as much about how he would like to be seen by others as about Chow's personality in explaining why. Like Napoleon, who was a complete man, Chow Enlai is a complete man. He knows about music, he knows about history, he knows about military science, he knows about what is happening in the world. He would be able to analyze the hippie problem. He takes care of everything. He looks into everything. He looks into everything minutely. Zulfi knew that Chow was dying of cancer, which was why Chow had sent his deputy Li to Pakistan. Less than a month later, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was convicted of electoral malpractices by Allahabad's High Court, mandatory punishment for which would have barred her from holding any elective office for 6 years. Instead of resigning, she appealed to India's Supreme Court and soon after that declared a state of emergency. All parties opposed to her rump Congress rule were banned. Most of her political opponents were arrested and she autocratically cancelled India's constitutional liberties and rights. Among those arrested was Zulfi's old friend Pilo Moody, Jaya Prakash Narayan, and Morarji Desai, who would replace her as Prime Minister in 2 years. Faced with the options of surrendering power or abandoning India's hard won freedoms, Indira Gandhi had no difficulty deciding which she preferred. India's press was first blacked out, then totally censored and controlled. More than 50,000 political dissenters were jailed, many of them tortured for daring to disagree with Madam Gandhi or her younger son Sanjay. She understands nothing, this Mrs. Gandhi, and acts off the bat without asking anyone's advice. Morarji Desai told Oriana Falachi just a few hours before his arrest. She's not a prime minister, she's an empress. Asked how he felt about Prime Minister Gandhi's conviction, Prime Minister Bhutto said, "We do not gloat over the predicaments of others. We take a serious and long term view of such situations. We have to be watchful lest Mrs. Indira Gandhi, bedeviled and bewildered by the present crisis, seeks to extricate herself from the mess by embarking upon an adventurous course against Pakistan. Bhutto understood his Indian counterpart well, but even Empress Indira knew there were limits beyond which her own military command would never permit her to act in pique or with impunity. Bhutto, moreover, had troubles enough with the outlawed National Awami Party and the rest of his angry opposition to refrain from telling the world how delighted he was at learning about the political plight of his bedeviled and bewildered New Delhi neighbor. And why gloat? His diplomatic restraint was more admirable. His warning against any adventurous course sufficed to convey the clear message he meant for Madame Gandhi. Tikka Khan put his troops on the highest alert all along the Indian border. Balochistan and NWFP, however, continued to pose more dangerously explosive problems to Islamabad Pindi than Delhi did. Attorney General Yahya Bakhtiar argued the central government's case against Wali Khan and the National Awami Party before Pakistan's Supreme Court in mid June 1975. Prime Minister Bhutto, during his visit to the grave of Sher Pao, said that he had laid down his life for the preservation of the ideology of Pakistan. Yahya Bakhtiar declared, there is simple evidence to show that National Awami Party has been playing into the hands of Afghanistan and serving in a way as the frontline organization for Afghan territorial designs on Pakistan. Yahya himself was a Pathan. His home, however, was in Quetta. Scion of the wealthy frontier family, he had been educated in Britain and was called to the bar from Lincoln's Inn several years before he first met fellow barrister Bhutto in Karachi. Like Bhutto, he had been a close personal friend of Hayat Khan Sherpao and argued with persuasive passion before the court in Rawalpindi. Wali Khan sought unsuccessfully to have the ban on his party lifted. He would eventually manage to clear himself and his party of all charges of disloyalty to Pakistan, as well as open advocacy of violence to subvert the rule of law, but was found guilty of advocating a policy of subversion and therefore was obliged to remain behind prison bars as long as Bhutto continued to rule. Mr. Bhutto always accused his political opponents of the very actions which he intends to perform himself. Wali Khan insisted, though Yahya Bakhtiar denied that charge in his subsequent rejoinder to the Supreme Court, arguing, this cap fits Mr. Wali Khan instead. While opposition political leaders of both India and Pakistan were being kept in jail by their autocratic prime ministers, the increasingly angry opposition to President Mujibur Rahman in Bangladesh launched a coup against its one party leader. Two young army officers, Majors Farooq Rahman and K.A. Rashid, planned and led the bloody murders of most of the family and closest friends of the man hailed 3 years earlier as Nation Unifier Father. Mujib's own First Minister for Water Resources and Power, Khandakar Mushtaq Ahmad, later Minister for Commerce and Foreign Trade, was privy to the conspiracy and immediately took over as president after the slaughter of Mujib and his family on Dhaka's blood-spattered Dhanmandi Road that mid-August morning. For a few moments, the charismatic president had managed with his defiant words to paralyze the first would-be killer, who caught him on the stairs inside his home and softly requested, Sir, please come. What do you want? Mujib asked him scornfully in Bengali. Have you come to kill me? Forget it. The Pakistan army couldn't do it. Who are you that you think you can? But the second intruder did what the first could not. He fired. A burst from his 10 gun. Mujib didn't have a chance. The bullets tore a huge hole in his right side. The blood soaked majors then went to rouse Mushtaq, informing him that he was now president. Before noon, he broadcast news of the fait accompli to his startled nation. Zulfi Bhutto was the first foreign leader to recognize the new fraternal government that same day and called upon all members of the Islamic Conference and all countries of the Third World to do likewise. He ordered the immediate dispatch of 50,000 tons of rice and 15 million yards of cloth to Dhaka as a modest contribution to our brothers in Bangladesh. President Khandakar Mushtaq could retain power for only 83 days before the next coup, led by generals rather than majors. 3 weeks after the first coup, Mahmood Ali, Zulfi's special advisor on how best to reintegrate Bangladesh with Pakistan, flew to London from Islamabad with the hope of winning enough support there to announce a confederation of the former wings of old Pakistan. Chief of Army Staff General Zia-ur-Rahman would not hear of that sort of subversion of Bangladesh's sovereignty, however, and a brief early November coup seemed to herald a return to Mujibism, but that too was soon crushed. After being kept under house arrest for several days, General Rahman was freed by his own sepoys and after 7th November catapulted to supreme power over Bangladesh, which he would retain till his own assassination, a little more than a half a decade later. I have always known you to be man of tremendous courage, of unusual wisdom and remarkable foresight. Begum Akhtar Suleiman, former Prime Minister Sohrawardi's daughter, wrote Zulfi that September. On the issue of Bangladesh, you have surpassed all expectations. You have shown generosity towards and love for brother Muslims in a manner that is beyond praise. Begum Suleiman was not alone in feeling this way about Prime Minister Bhutto, whose popularity throughout the Islamic world skyrocketed as Bangladesh plunged deeper into dark pools of its own once most precious blood, and as Indira Gandhi's image sank to its lowest point as well, with thousands of Indians locked behind emergency bars. Zulfi, of course, was delighted at this happy change of his political and diplomatic image as well as fortune. Bhutto flew to France that October and was asked by a reporter of Le Figaro what he expected from his visit to Paris, replying that he had many important matters to discuss with French officials economic, educational, cultural, and we have also collaboration and association in armaments purchases. From France, he went on to Romania, where he had talks about Pakistan's need for heavy water for its secret nuclear weapons plant near Pindi, Islamabad. Responding to the request by Bucharest's Ager Press to comment on liquidation of the gap between the poor and the rich countries of the world, Zulfi said, "These are burning questions. Indeed, it is a furnace, a live one, in which mankind is placed. Its flames are spreading. There has to be fundamental change in the outlook of nations, the developed nations in particular, to get a better economic order. The battle of the OPEC countries is not their battle alone. It is a battle for all the underprivileged and exploited nations of the world. We will maintain our solidarity with them and we will support them." The euphoria Zulfi felt in the aftermath of what had happened to Indira Gandhi and Mujib and subsequent changes in Bangladesh carried his racing mind ahead to new visions of the Third World leadership and of its potential for Pakistan, which as yet remained perforce nebulous. But with the help of France, Romania, China, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, he hoped that Pakistan would soon become a nuclear power. As the fourth anniversary of his assumption of power approached, Zulfi Bhutto knew that he would have to face the electorate again in the not very distant future. Because the constitution had not been adopted till 1973, he could legally have delayed that inevitable deadline till 1978. Yet, why should he? As the most popular, if not as yet the most powerful leader in South Asia, as well as the convener of the most successful Islamic summit, his diplomatic rating had never been higher. The next summit he planned to host, moreover, would embrace the entire third world, from Cuba to China, from Libya to Bangladesh and Indonesia. He would bring all of them to Islamabad Pindi this time, and whether or not India chose to accept his invitation, Pakistan would rise above New Delhi in the eyes of most of the world. From the humiliation and ignominious defeat of 1971, so glorious a resurrection would be acclaimed by the peoples everywhere as little less than a miracle, the work of one leader alone, one great leader of the people, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. To achieve such unique glory and fulfillment of his destiny, Zulfi knew he first had to win the next general election, which he planned to hold in about 1 year, rather than two, because he was always acutely conscious of his age and wanted to finish what he had to do before he turned 50 in 1978. Zulfi understood better than all his combined opposition just how difficult winning the next elections could be for him. However idealistic or visionary his diplomatic dreams may have been, he was always a political realist. He had little or no hope of winning any portion of the frontier, though he would try till the very eve of the election to negotiate a settlement with Wali Khan and his Badshah father. As for his own Sindh and Punjab, nature seemed determined to undermine his popularity in both states. This year's floods were almost as bad as the devastating damage done in 1973. Rains had started soon after mid July in Punjab and continued through late September to wreak havoc all over rural Sindh, including Larkana. Almost as many Pakistani soldiers were assigned to filling flood control sandbags as to guarding the Indian border. Damage estimates were in the tens of millions of dollars, and thousands were forced to stay off their land till October. Those were the fortunates who survived. Perhaps it was touring all the flood damaged villages, hearing the tearful tales of the peasants who had lost everything, that convinced him once again that the time had come to launch a major new economic reform scheme, one designed truly to help the majority of Pakistan's peasants and small landowners. Cynics said that Zulfi was obviously starting his next national election campaign a bit early. I am addressing tonight the toiling farmers of our land. Prime Minister Bhutto pridefully began his broadcast to the nation that 10th November. With effect from the Rabi spring crop of 1975 to 1976, small landowners owning up to 12 acres of irrigated land or 25 acres of unirrigated land shall be exempted from the payment of land revenue, local rates, development cess, and all cesses related to land revenue. It was his most revolutionary move to date, affecting more than 80% of Pakistan's landowners and more people than had all of his earlier industrial, bank, and cotton mill nationalizations. Millions of Pakistani peasants would never thereafter forget that it was their Qaide Awam who lifted the crushing burden of taxes from their sorely bent backs. Bhutto won more rural votes that November night, for himself and his party than he had lost in the previous 3 years of alienating fired bureaucrats, dismissed colleagues, and insulted political opponents combined. He lost some votes that night as well, for the grandly cancelled revenue would have been made up by doubling the taxes of large landowners, over 50 irrigated or 100 unirrigated acres. But the number was paltry compared to the peasant support he had secured. Many of his old Vadero friends would call him a traitor to his own class, of course, but Zulfi was used to harsh abuse from friends as well as foes. His political skin was tough enough to take virtually anything said. He had even stopped reacting to abusive language of a Raza Ahmed or Wali Khan, content to leave such matters for the courts to sort out. My fellow citizens, tonight I feel greatly relieved and thankful to Allah Almighty that I have now fulfilled the most significant promise made to the agrarian community. It should therefore be a proud day for them. They can make it prouder by resolving that they will work hard and produce more. May they prosper. May their children be happy. This has been my prayer and this has been my struggle. Cries of G.A. Bhutto and Bhutto Zindabad echoed from Larkana to Lahore, from Karachi to Rawalpindi and back, as tens of thousands who heard his voice danced for joy and cheered their saintly leader of the people. That December, on the fourth anniversary of his return from United States to pick up the pieces of what remained of Pakistan, Prime Minister Bhutto again addressed his nation. He started with an assessment of Pakistan's foreign policy. In this time of flux and peril, noting how firmly anchored his policy during these last 4 turbulent years had been, alluding to the success of Islamic Summit in Lahore, the lifting of the US arms embargo, and the restoration of cordial relations with Bangladesh, as well as strong fraternal relations with all Muslim states. Zulfi could indeed take credit for having achieved all of his major foreign policy objectives. When he turned to the economy, however, he readily conceded that nothing had caused us greater anxiety because, with spiraling inflation, the honest citizen who earns his bread through his toil is hard hit. But the problem was one of the global recession combined with inflation from which Pakistan could not possibly insulate herself. Nonetheless, he noted many modest gains, claiming improved consumption levels in fruit, grains, clothing, and vegetable oils for a majority of our people. He promised, moreover, that in the coming fiscal year, production would start in new fertilizer factories currently being built in Multan and at Mirpur, Mathelo, Sadiqabad, and Hazara. The Karachi steel mill was expected to start production in 1978 to 1979, and present planning called for the building of 2 new sugar mills each year over the next half decade. He recapitulated, of course, the momentous land revenue remission promised on 10th November. 7.4 million Pakistanis out of a total population of 8.9 million would be affected. That is, the owners of some 42% of all currently farmed acreage would no longer be subject to any taxes. He defended his radical administrative reforms of 1973 as consistent with his party's election manifesto to wipe out the crushing legacy of colonial rule. He also stressed the urgent need to reform the legal system so that quick and speedy justice would be available to all without the crippling burden of unbearable litigation. And he spoke at some length about pending changes in the criminal and civil justice system, starting with the cumbersome commitment proceedings in a murder trial, which was at this time and would hereafter remain very much on his mind. 2 years later, from his death cell, Zulfi wrote to Nusrat, I was shocked to hear that you have not engaged a first class lawyer for the tribunal matter. It is a question of our honor. I do not want the people of Sindh to feel let down by us. You do not seem to fully understand the psychology of Sindhi mind, to fight every inch of the way. Do not be slipshod. Follow my instruction in such matters. Too much is at stake. All our resources have to be used and all the holes plugged. It should not be like my trial. I was left to the mercy of a lazy lawyer who did no homework, no research, and forgot documents in his car and forgot instructions. It was a fatal blunder, an unforgivable one. Do not repeat it in your case. A lot of dirty things are happening behind the scenes. Yahya Bakhtiar has capitulated, broken down, and joined the conspiracy. But why is everyone doing it? To dig my grave? Was there no one living he could trust? Truly trust? Completely. Not his own wife, his own lawyer, his own closest colleagues in the party or in the cabinet. What had become of all of them? Why had they deserted, abandoned, turned on him? Why was it that the entire world seemed by then to have joined the conspiracy against Zulfikar Ali Bhutto? Time is of the essence, he penned, desperately underlining those words in his dark, dirty cell. Did no one else understand that?